Well, good evening and welcome to another great event by the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Turn the Page. Tonight, our topic is human rights, human wrongs, writing about immigration. And we are honored to have two distinguished novelists with us today, Edwidge Danticat and Patricia Engel. And I'm going to introduce them, read a little biography, and then we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to start the question. We have some great questions tonight from Dayton Literary Peace Prize advisory board members, everybody chipped in to put together some great questions, people who really love both Edwidge and Patricia's work. And then also I'm going to encourage you, while you're listening, if you think of a question that you'd love to ask the author, go to the Q&A at the very bottom, type your question in there, we'll be monitoring them, and maybe towards the end of this, we'll get to some of those questions, and we always do. So please feel free to add those questions to the Q&A. I'm going to start by introducing Patricia Engel, who is the author of The Veins of the Ocean, winner of the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction. It's Not Love, It's Just Paris, winner of the International Latino Book Award, and Vita, a finalist for the PEN, Hemingway, and Young Lions Fiction Awards. New York Times notable book and winner of Colombia's National Book Award, Premio Biblioteca de Narrativa Colombiana. She is recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her stories appear in the Best American Short Stories, the Best American Mystery Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and elsewhere. Born to Colombian parents, Patricia teaches creative writing at the University of Miami. Her new novel, Infinite Country, has just been published to rave reviews. Welcome, Patricia.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Gilbert. Happy to be with you.
Great to see you again. Edwidge Danticat is the author of numerous books, including The Art of Death, a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, Claire of the Sea Light, a New York Times notable book, Brother, I'm Dying, a National Book Critics Circle Award and winner of the National Book Award finalist, and the winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in 2008. The Dewbreaker, a PEN Faulkner Award finalist and winner of the inaugural Story Prize, and Crick Crock, also a National Book Award finalist, and Edwidge is the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and winner of the 2020 Vilsack Foundation Prize in Literature. She's been published in the New Yorker, the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, and elsewhere, and she too lives in Miami. I am Gilbert Kill. First of all, welcome, Edwidge. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My name is Gilbert King. I too am very much affiliated with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. I was the 2013 nonfiction runner-up for Devil in the Grove, and I'm also on the advisory board. And while both Patricia and Edwidge are joining us from beautiful Miami, I am in the less glamorous part of Florida right now, Lakeland in the center, but it's still lovely. It's just not Miami. So we're going to start out with some questions. And again, I really encourage everybody to go to the Q&A and enter your own questions. If something strikes you as you're listening, feel free to put it in there. Many questions do get in. So I'm going to start out with questions for both of you. I'm going to start out by saying the Haitian and Colombian U.S. diasporas are both centered in Miami, Florida, and New York City, both cities with high living costs, yet family connection is often the only way for Haitians and Colombians to successfully immigrate. Edwidge, I'll start with you. Compared to all immigrants, Haitians are more likely to be naturalized U.S. citizens, participate in the labor force, and work in service occupations, but have lower household incomes. Yet immigration policies still make it difficult for Haitians to successfully immigrate. Which of your characters best captures the confusion and frustrations over Haitian immigration?
Well, thank you, Gilbert. It's nice. Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's nice to be here with my friend Patricia. Those stats, I didn't know those specific stats, but I'll start with, you talk about the characters versus real life. So I'll start, like today, for example, there was a deportation flight to Haiti, I think, which was the 35th this year. So in terms of the way immigration treats Haitian immigrants, especially poor Haitian immigrants. It does not change often very much, no matter what the administration is, sadly. But in New York, where I first landed when I came in the 1980s, it was a very difficult time to be Haitian because it was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. This is I guess I tell people this is my second pandemic. And Haitians were the only ones identified by nationality as being high risk. So in terms of, so we lived in a building where people worked in hotels, where they worked in people's homes, and all these people initially were fired because people didn't, they didn't know how the disease was transmitted. So that's not the first history of Haitians in the US, but that's when I came. So all of, that history, and then there was a huge march on the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1990s to protest discrimination based on that stigmatization. And there's been community building now, we're many generations in. So all my characters, I think over time reflect that, it's sort of, I try to write about a history that I lived through, that my family has lived through, using all the experiences that I have. And often, people are supported or come up because there's the kind of community grouping, like you said, family gatherings that lend to survival, that gradually leads to the next generation's, gradual, I guess, ascent or comfort in the new culture.
Excellent. Patricia, it's a very similar question for you. The Colombian diaspora closely resembles the US population in many respects, with very similar demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, including age, educational attainment, household income, and employment in professional occupations. Yet immigration policies still make it difficult for Colombians without context in the US Colombian diaspora to enter. Which of your characters best captures the confusion and frustration over Colombian immigration?
Well, similar to Edwidge, that's something that sort of populated all my books in different ways. I'm the daughter of Colombians, and so my earlier work was really writing towards that experience, the generational divides between parents who arrived and their children who have an upbringing in a different country. And Infinite Country is a story about a family in the active process of immigrating, where the 5 family members each occupy a different place on this migratory status spectrum. And I think that that's something that's very particular, is the way the United States kind of frames immigration as documented, undocumented, or, this and that, like you've arrived or you're coming, and all these binaries, when really it's such a wide spectrum of possibilities and statuses that are in limbo, in process, are changing from one day to the next with regard to whatever the administration at the time is saying, or what the dates are on the paperwork, or anything like that. So in Infinite Country, I'd say that this is a family that is extremely typical. You have 2 young teenagers who fall in love in Colombia, and they luck into tourist visas, which is a very typical way of coming. They come with tourist visas. And just because their life changes very quickly in the 6 months that they're allotted to be in the United States, they decide to overstay. So in the matter of a day, they go from being tourists to being defined as something else, by the dates on their paperwork. And because of that, the world shrinks. The possibilities available to them shrink overnight as well. And the way that they are perceived and perceive the world around them changes dramatically as well. So that story is set over 20 or so years, beginning in the 1990s, which was a particularly violent time in Colombia's history, up until about 2018. And the reason why I wanted to set the story was to really show how both the United States and Colombia changed drastically during that period. So the Colombian diaspora is an enormous diaspora. It's one of the largest in the world. There are something like 5 million, probably more, Colombians living outside of Colombia. And Colombia has the largest internally displaced population in the world as a result of civil conflict, more than Syria, more than any other country on earth. So the need for movement is obviously there. However, the system has been so limited by the quota on how many Colombians are admitted into the United States. And of course, those are given out for, favors in some cases, or because you get lucky, or because you have the finances to be able to prove that you have incentive to return home, all sorts of things. But in very few ways is it fair. So the short answer would be probably infinite country.
That's great. And this is another question that both of you can answer, and I'll go back and refresh if you need it. But you both deal with the stories from the old religions, the native religions, and you reference the gods and goddesses of the old stories as belief systems that still flow through the native communities and teach lessons from young to old. What stories from the old religions find a home in your books? And what do they teach the characters and the reader about land, water, time, love, boundaries, and people? Edwidge, if you'd like to start.
For me, it's not so much an old religion. It's a still vibrant and practiced religion of Vodou, which has a very large pantheon of deities that goes back to Africa. And there's when people were enslaved and they weren't allowed to practice their religions, there was sort of the syncretism with Catholicism, so that you're looking at what looks like Catholic saints, but they have this double meaning. So in Breath Eye's memory, for example, there's a whole wide range of every religion that's practiced in Haiti. It's perhaps, except at that time there was less, Islam, but now there are people who practice Islam. But so we have these different, and within this family, there's people who practice Vodou, there are people who are Christians, who are what we call Protestants, and there are people who are just, who kind of have the younger people who've kind of transformed Vodou into a kind of spiritual practice that is less defined, and others who mix everything. So I think that knowledge, both through religion and through storytelling, is something that especially the elders of my characters try to pass on, because when it's that direct transmission of knowledge is cut off with migration. So in Breath Eye's Memory, which was my very first book, which is not my life, but in a way mirrors, because people, when I was growing up, and this character too, always knew that I was going to be leaving. So my parents left me with my aunt and uncle when I was 4, and then they were undocumented, and it was 8 years before we reunited, but there was always like I was going to live somewhere else. And I think people in my family, my uncle was a minister, but we also, there are people in the family of different faiths, and people always almost trying to stuff into me the knowledge that, for me to take with me whenever I would go to the next place. So I think Breath Eye's Memory and Creek Crack is probably, and it's not incidental that they were my first 2 books, that I was also trying to transmit and put down all these things that I had learned, knowledge, not just through religion, but through folklore, with Patricia does so beautifully in Infinite Country, and in terms of how she also weaves those stories through the daily lives of people. Because I think people who are in dire situations, sometimes we reach back for our stories, we reach back for this kind of spiritual knowledge, for strength and for the ability to keep going.
Patricia, do you need that read back, or can you follow that question?
No, I think I got it. Yeah, I mean, to one of Edwige's last points, that about how reaching back for the stories. And I think that sometimes in the case of immigration, sometimes your stories are the only thing that you take with you. In The Veins of the Ocean, which is my 3rd book, it's set between South Florida and Cuba and Cartagena on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. So that's a very different atmosphere than inland in Colombia, which is, high in the Andes Mountains, where Infinite Country is set. Spiritually, there's kind of like, different sort of results as a consequence of colonization and who arrived where, who managed to affect the indigenous population in the different places. So in the veins of the ocean, there's a lot, it speaks a lot to Cuban, Afro-Cuban religion, Santeria, and also the syncretism that happened on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. An infinite country, which is set largely in Bogota, which is high in the Andes, as I mentioned. It's the territory that belonged to the Muisca, the indigenous civilization of Colombia, one of the 4 advanced civilizations of the Americas. And, you know, some people are familiar with the legend of El Dorado, for example. So that's Muisca. That's, but a lot of people are more familiar with like the Mayas or the Incas or the Aztecs. The Muisca are less popular, in part because they were mostly exterminated. So there's fewer sort of traces of that history. But Bogota is my mother's hometown. And my mother's family was in the region for centuries. And my mother has some Muisca ancestry. So my mother was always very proud of those stories. And I grew up with a lot of them. And because the characters in Infinite Country are of that land as well, it's really important, I think, to show not only what happens when in immigration, there's of course the matter of displacement and movement and all these things, but in the loss of leaving your home, everything you know, the people you love, there's that severing of your connection to the land. And the land itself carries these stories of all the people who populated it before. So those things are things that we are told and repeat, but they're really physically present in the land in a lot of ways. And so some people call it mythology or folklore, or just ancestral history, and not really see it any different from any other history that we take as truth, because it offers, like anything else, explanations for the origin of the world, how mankind came to exist among different animal species, what happens to us when we die, and our reason for being. And of course, the laws and the rules that we should abide by in relation to one another.
That was great. Edwidge, I have a question for you. When you first came to Dayton as the winner in 2008, you were very pregnant. So a very belated congratulations. But can you tell us about that child who's probably a teenager now? What does she know of Haiti? What stories do you tell her of your home, of your family, of your uncle?
Well, that child is now 12, going on 24, as they say. Patricia knows her. She actually, for my children, I always wanted them to know Haiti intimately. And we were lucky that their grandmother, my husband's mother, was living in Haiti. And so she went to Haiti at 3 months. You know, as soon as we could, we went with her. And she's had now the privilege, she spent Christmas in Haiti. She's gone in the summer. Not so much recently, but because of recent events, there's been a lot of protests, and but she knows, and I really wanted them to know, my girls to know Haiti as like a place like any other, because a lot of what happens in diaspora is that our parents, we grew up with parents who would be like, "It's the most beautiful place. It's the most wonderful place." It's, and then when the child says, "I want to go," they're like, "No, you can't, you can't go, not right now." And so there was like that duality of like, of this idealization, and then they make their kids afraid. So I wanted my daughters to be like really familiar with it. And I tell this joke that I hate all the time, but it actually happened one day when my little one, Layla, we were driving on a back road in Haiti, and my girls, because my mother was in New York, every place that wasn't Miami to them was New York. And so at some point we're in a back road in Haiti, and it's like one of those, like, you're on a donkey, and then she was like 3, Layla, and she says, "This is not New York." So it's just kind of like, so for me, it was just always that they know this place and that they know it's theirs in some way. That was always very important to me, and that they speak the language, even though you have now that thing that immigrant parents complain about, where you speak to them in your language and they speak to you back in English. That starts happening when they go to school. But but when they're in Haiti, they can speak, they speak to other children. So that was always very important to me, that Haiti was in some way part of their lives.
Wow, interesting. Patricia, in Veins of the Ocean, you write of many prisons, physical prisons with bars and wires for both man and animal, countries as prisons, a sense of duty as a prison, a sense of the past as inescapable. So many immigrants come to the US looking for freedom. The dolphins escape into the ocean. Can humans be so lucky? To what degree is prison a physical state, a mental state? Is there an escape?
Well, I'd say prison is a very real place. So that's, something I have some familiarity with. I should say I was born in the United States and I benefited from dual citizenship and being able to travel with ease. Of course, Colombia had times of difficulty when, as Edwidge said, my parents were like, no, we can't go right now. But I was never limited by my ability to travel from one place to the other, whereas many people that close to me, loved ones and everything, did not have that access, did not have that privilege. So prison, is something that's very interesting to me, exploring the idea of it, and emotional prison, sentimental prisons, physical prison, because I grew up in a family with incarcerated family members. So as I said, it was a very real experience. And like in the Veins of the Ocean, it also describes the experience of the families of incarcerated people and what they undergo is sort of a parallel sentence, emotional sentence. And the reckoning of when someone you love has done something terrible, right? But also the thing about immigration is the way that it's criminalized. Also, I think it's something that needs to be examined as well, is how we've been, taught to criminalize something that's a human instinct for good, for survival, for protection, for caring for your loved ones. It's the intentions are all the things that we value in human character, right? Yet we're sort of conditioned to look at it, to look down on it, and frame it in such a negative way. And living within that framework and being perceived in that way is, in a way, another kind of confinement, right? As are stereotypes, and the media has a great hand in that as well. And we, as a population, fall victim to it all the time. It happens all the time where I hear readers now say, "Oh, I never heard Colombia was a beautiful country. The only thing I ever heard about it was drug trafficking and murders," and people accepted that. And that's the thing, is that when stereotypes are so normalized and the omission of the wider truth of places and peoples and experiences like that of immigration are just ignored, there's a total erasure, and it creates this blindness in people. And really what it does is handicap our own thinking, but also our consciences in different ways. So I hope that, that just in exploring prison as a very loose concept in my writing in different ways, maybe people can start to think about the prisons they live in without even being aware of it, how their own thinking is even confined without them being aware of it. So.
Yeah, and I want to just to say on that I think for immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, prison is a very real thing. Like detention is for some people the first thing they encounter, when they arrive here. You mentioned my uncle, who was 81 years old, who came from Haiti in 2004, was detained and brought to a Chrome detention center here and died basically in immigration custody. So I think for a lot of people, they don't realize that element of it, because, you have the whole right wing conversation of like, oh, I call it catch and release, and they feel like everybody's flowing in, but there's such, so many people are detained and in private prisons, profit-making prisons, and then often very cruelly, like they'll be moved to, just like other incarcerated people, they'll be moved to a place very far from where they can access the lawyer their family members got for them, or even their family members themselves. So that's a part of the, you know, we saw like the children in cages, but they're also adults in cages, you know, in the immigration is like prison detention is also very real part of being an undocumented person.
Wow, that's a great point. Edwidge, I just want to follow up with a different question for you now. Many of the stories in Everything Inside include betrayal. Betrayal by friends, lovers, countries, your own body or mind. Guilt about betraying one's country by leaving it seems to haunt the characters. Is there a connection with betrayal that spills into other aspects of an immigrant's life after leaving the home culture and country for another?
Well, I think there's something about being an immigrant that makes you extraordinarily vulnerable and to many things, but fraud is one of them for sure. In terms of even, you know, when I go to immigration panels or workshops, there's always this constant warning because there's a whole almost business out there of trying to say to, you know, to say to people, I can get you residency, I can do this, or even, you know, when my uncle was in detention, people, I had friends who were working on his case, but then you had people who were calling to say, I can get him out, just give me $5,000. And, you know, and so there's a kind of vulnerability that you have that people can abuse your trust, right? And you're so hopeful, you're so trusting, you don't know the lay of the land, that I think that betrayal, that part of it, the betrayal is that's a very concrete kind of betrayal because you can be too trusting from not knowing. But in terms of in the stories, I was also, you know, there's definitely betrayal throughout, but I was, for me, that I was just concentrating more on the complicated element of love. And when we're new to a place, we're trying to root ourselves, we're trying to find people to help us survive this place. Sometimes we make very, you know, this is in Infinite Country as well, where you kind of make very difficult choices. You cling to the wrong people, you keep secrets, because again of that vulnerability makes you very open to being, you know, to being betrayed, to being abused as you're gaining ground. And so there's always these wonderful stories, and it happens in my family and other people where that person is like, I met the right person at the right time and that saved my life. But there are more cases from people who are, you know, abusing people who are crossing the desert, or people, there's always these moments where you're vulnerable because you're in a vulnerable state. That betrayal, whether it's with people close to you or people, you know, who just are like, have a business for that you're vulnerable to betrayal.
Wow. Patricia, in an essay for Electric Lit, you take exception to the term immigrant experience as reductive in describing both the individual and collective trauma endured by immigrants. You prefer the term exile to describe the human struggle to exist in a new life. Would you talk about the levels of exile an immigrant feels as they are reflected in your work?
That's a good question, Gilbert.
Came from smarter people than me, trust me.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of this comes from just my own psychological exploration of my life as the daughter of immigrants. You know, I did not immigrate myself, but I'm the product of immigration, and my whole family experienced the rupture in the family tree that exists as a result of, you know, someone's decision to emigrate, to leave and go from one place to the other. So my life was defined by immigration, even though I was not the one doing the crossing over. But my life is the crossing over, right? And it's we used to think about, you know, the hyphen, right? The space in between the two countries and all that. But I think as I've gotten older and I've kind of settled into the space, I realized, no, that's a very small space to live in, the little hyphen, you know? When in fact, we can be going back and forth between these spaces constantly. So I feel like my exile from Colombia as a result of my birth is as valid as my exile from the United States by virtue of being born here to parents who are from elsewhere, you know. So when I talk about the immigrant experience, which is one of those terms that people feel very comfortable just tossing around without really thinking about what is it actually saying. It's not really saying anything, you know. It's like, I write books about the female experience. I write books about the human experience, about, you know, the lover experience. I don't know, all kinds of experiences, right? So why do I have to, you know, settle onto one little, category of definition? And it's like, you know, what they do at the supermarket with like the ethnic foods aisle and all that. You know, so I just think it's ridiculous, to be honest with you. I don't even think it's worth really interrogating that much. It's like, can't we move beyond these singular phrasings to describe things? But that's kind of speaks to what I was saying before about how we just have this automatic thinking about so many things, you know, and instead of reading a book like Infinite Country, let's say, it's like a family story. It's a family story. It's a love story. It's lots of things, right? But then it gets spoken about like it's about immigrants, these people who are immigrants, you know, and like they're wearing, you know, immigrants like across their chest, you know, and that's all they are. So I just think we need to push beyond that. We need to think wider and bigger in terms of what it means to move about the world, to exist in a world that is defined by movement. Literally, that's how we are alive as a species, and why thinking about immigration as such a a closed process is the way that we frame things.
Edwidge, do you have anything to add on? I know you two are very close friends. I wonder if this is something you talk about.
Well, I think, you know, I was gonna joke to Patricia that I almost wore my immigrant shirt, like,
oh yeah,
like
I have one of those too. Yeah.
I think folks wear those shirts because we want to, you know, like when I wear mine, I want to say, like, I don't know what you think immigrants are, but I am one. Just, it's the same for also being Haitian. Like sometimes people have those very reductive ideas about, you know, and you want to actually celebrate like other immigrants by saying, I'm one of the many possibilities. And we have to try to avoid, that's like the sort of the exceptional immigrant narrative too, because it's just kind of like the exceptional victims of hate crimes or the exceptional victims of police brutality, where it's like, we only care if that person is, you know, is a neurosurgeon, and it's like, oh, look what's possible. Like that person is an immigrant, where we less attention to like the people who are basically holding up the country, picking up like the vegetables and the fruits and like, you know, to celebrate all kinds of, you know, all natures of immigrants. But I remember Jhumpa Lahiri a couple of years ago when she was asked about it, like immigrant fiction, and she says like all fiction is about arrival in some way, you know, like what she talked about Nathaniel Hawthorne and others, you know, being, you know, also like if you, you know, she's like, I think she made a point similar to what Patricia just said about like the immigrant experiences. There are so many, like you know, the singularity of every life is very different. And even within families where you have, as Patricia said, the mixed status families, that there's not a, you know, it's like a broad immigrant experience. And it's interesting, like to also see like the evolution of certain thinking, because before when we thought about that hyphen, it was like, ooh, it's so wonderful to have landed someplace, right? But then more and more we have sort of this transnationalism, like I can be in Port-au-Prince now faster than I could be in New York in terms of, you know, the flight. So is that, you know, and I think that's why sometimes people hesitate to call themselves exiled, because you can go back so quickly. So when it's wonderful to see like the, you know, these different evolution of certain terms, and you know, the ones that, you know, we keep, we embrace, and we're challenging, but at least it's not static, right? In terms of how we're thinking about immigration, which, you know, a century ago was like, you get on a big ship, you never return. And now you can go back and forth, you know, or you're always on, you know, the communication methods even, you know, like you can, my cousin sometimes would be like, I'm eating this, you know, like, oh, you know, for my parents, I had to go to a phone booth once a week when I was going up to call them, you know, and we had 5 minutes of a phone call. That's how we communicated. Now everybody's on the WhatsApp in the family all the time. So it just, so these terms, because immigration has changed, also these terminology also definitely has to change as well.
Yeah, I think Edwidge is absolutely right. I think just like, you know, the way we think about immigration is already like growing obsolete by the minute because of what technology permits, you know, just even with FaceTime and things like that. Whereas, you know, you didn't see people for years on end. But it's also, I think one of the things I find just so silly about something like calling something like immigrant fiction, as some people do, is like, oh, okay, never mind that like the majority of the United States population, at least, is the product of immigration in some way, even if immigration is not in their family's recent memory in this generation or the last 2 or 3, let's say. But then what do? Should we just call everyone else's fiction like settler fiction or something like that? And just come up with names for everything? Because once you start applying labels, like slapping them around, you know, you got to do it to everyone.
Wow. Patricia, I want to follow up with something. Both Veins of the Ocean and Infinite Country begin with horrific scenes. Man throws an infant from a flue, cat is burned alive, subsequently human tormentors. What about the human condition elicits these descriptions from you? Are you worried that a reader will put down the book in the face of such horrific scenes, especially since the endings of your books are much more hopeful?
You know, I don't know, Gilbert. I have to really sit with that one probably. Yeah, when you put it that way, it sounds horrible.
Yeah.
You know? You know, but again, like I'm a storyteller, so I just kind of, you know, my interest leads with images that have captured me. It happens that those 2 openings. Well, the opening of The Veins of the Ocean, which is a baby being tossed off a bridge, was a story that my mom told me. And it was a real thing that happened, a real story. And it's happened in a bunch of places. Infinite Country opens with a teenage girl breaking out of a juvenile detention center, which is also a real story that I read in like an online news you know, a publication or something. But then you're talking about the burning, you know, a crime involving animal cruelty. That was also a real story that was told to me by a girl who was escorting me around to like a literary festival in Colombia. So a lot of these things are things from real life. You know, I didn't even make them up. They're just dark stuff that I've heard. But I think what interests me as a writer is just kind of the tangles of humanity around those events, and that they're not always so cut and dry, that there's like this emotional hurricane behind them that really, when I've heard these stories, led me to wonder, not you know, develop snap judgments about how right or wrong something may be. And that to me is kind of the interesting entry point into a lot of fiction, is navigating the gray moral areas, and when good people find themselves doing bad things, or when bad people end up doing, you know, honorable things, or what we think are honorable things, and you know, the darkness and the light in everybody.
That's really interesting. You know, I had a curious question just listening, you know, to the way that question was phrased, and also your answer to it. And one of the things that I get asked a lot, because I write about very dark and painful subjects in nonfiction, is what do you as an author do for self-care? And, you know, obviously if you're inspired by events in real life, it's much more traumatic in a way, and you're trying to grasp with that. And I'm just curious what each of you does for your own self-care when you're dealing with some of these issues and some of these themes that are painful, and anyone can tackle that. Edwidge, if you'd like to start.
Well, I think I remember when I was writing a novel called The Farming of Bones, and it's about a massacre of Haitian Dominican cane workers in the Dominican Republic in 1937. And when I was doing research and I was reading a lot of testimonials by a priest from the border area, and I was like crying all the time writing that book. I was crying all the time. And then the first time I did a reading in public, I was just like sobbing. And then someone was like, "Oh, look, she's moved by her own book." Like they thought it was a weird joke. But I try to, like, self-care. I'm not great at self-care, sadly. Like I should sleep more, I should exercise more, all of all of that. But I try to think of like whatever I am describing, it cannot, like, someone living that it was worse for them. So for me, in a way, that's not self-care, but that's a kind of perspective that helps in proceeding through. And everything that I've sort of like suffered writing, like when I look back years later, I'm glad I didn't walk away. I feel like that sort of my own agony with the subject was helpful to the writing, was helpful to me in terms of processing something, especially if it's deeply personal. Like the writing is a self-care, is I guess what I'm saying. And it may be because I don't have that many hobbies, but but writing is my self-care.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Patricia, do you have anything to add about that?
Well, I mean, Edwidge is a hero in like her courage for the things that she tackles in her writing, and I'm nowhere near that. You know, I kind of protect myself with fiction, right? And whereas when, you know, if I'm writing towards a more you know, a memoir or nonfiction, for me that's much more difficult, and usually I don't feel equipped to write a lot of things, so I don't, because it can be so difficult. So I sort of write what I feel like I can handle, you know, and there's things that I want to write yet where I feel like I can't handle it yet. You know, I'll just give you an example. My great-grandfather died in a concentration camp in Austria, and I've always sort of wanted to go deeper into that. And his wife who died by suicide. And for me, it's enormously painful still. So I still, just as a writer, don't have the kind of the chops yet to tackle that emotionally. Whereas in fiction, I feel like I can sort of, you know, take breaths more and distance myself when I need to. And so as a writer, I mean, that's part of the journey for me. That's an ongoing thing, what I can handle and what I'm still working on handling. But in terms of self-care, you know, for me, the writing is the pleasure, but then it just taking writing off the table, I just have sort of a very quiet, peaceful home life most of the time, and just, you know, being around friends and loved ones and nature and fresh air. Those are always good antidotes for when you need to kind of, you know, pull the tension out of a writing day or something like that.
Very nice. Edwidge, can you talk a bit about the function of storytelling in creating and maintaining identity among diasporic people? I'm thinking of Grandma Melina's stories in Brother, I'm Dying, but that function may extend to writing and publishing by emigres and refugees and their children, such as yourself.
Well, I always tell, you know, people like, who taught you to write? I always say that it's like the storytellers of my childhood. And the framing was, you know, when I was growing up in the city, there would be these blackouts, you know, like the time with the electricity would go out. and or in the summer when they sent us, as my brother used to say, with a bag of rice, a bag of cornmeal, and some oil to the country for 3 months. And then at the end, we came back for school. There was a lot of storytelling there, you know, because there was nothing else. You know, you roamed the countryside during the day, and then at night, you were told stories, and we told each other stories. And the elders in my family, there was such a liveliness to it that if you were nodding off, they would just go into a song, or it would get suspenseful. It was very interactive. So I felt like I learned that element of storytelling from there. But then when I was writing Brother, I'm Dying, I realized after my father died, like I remember this story that I was told about a girl whose father had died, which is in the book. And I was like, oh, that's the other reason I was told those stories, because they were meant to help me survive big things in my life. And there's like a story about, having to leave the town you're from. And then when I had to go to New York, I was like, oh, this is why I was told that story. So I think, it goes back to what we were saying before about having, I think, storytelling as a tool of survival. And I've seen ways now, since my books were published, I was invited to, I've been invited to talk to a group of lawyers who represent people who are seeking asylum, because the lawyers they'll say, we have like 5 minutes to tell this person's story to this judge who could not care less. And so I've done workshop with lawyers who, like, how do you tell a story like that's compelling? Like, you synthesize that person's story to tell it to a judge. I've been, with medical students who are working in psychiatry with people who've been traumatized, people who are coming by boat, who were assaulted on the boat, who are now in detention, and they're not speaking. And so if they're working with a psychiatrist, they have to be able to tell their stories not just for the immigration purpose, but for their healing. So storytelling is a very powerful tool, which I learned, I think, gradually throughout my life. I was told initially the stories, I thought it was entertaining, but then as I've come across some big moments in my life, and I think back to stories, you think back to why are there so many motherless children in the stories that I was told? Because there's like such a high infant mortality, maternal mortality. It's like all these things as you get older, you're like, oh, I was being given these tools for my life. That even goes beyond writing, but certainly have weave themselves into the writing.
It's really interesting. Patricia, this is a little bit of a process question, but I'm just curious, how did you determine who would be the narrator in Infinite Country? What qualities make an effective narrator in your point of view? And does a narrator have anything in common with you as a writer?
Well, so Infinite Country is narrated by the eldest daughter of this family of five, named Karina, and she's the daughter who was born in Colombia and brought to the United States as a baby, and then grows up undocumented as a result. So in my mind, she was really she was the one who was the family chronicler or family witness. And I think a lot of families, or in most families, there's someone who kind of takes on that role of being the truth teller, the one who kind of knows everybody's business, or is everyone's confidant, and is the one that is the observer and maybe is the insightful one, or just simply is the one who cares about being the memory of the family. Certainly in my family, I'm that person. But I think it's pretty typical for writers, that you're the one sort of taking it all in and finding meaning in it all. So in the case of Infinite Country, Karina's, she's what they call undocumented, another label there, and she's resisting that and rejecting that. So the book is in itself an act of resistance in that way, documenting her family story, making it real, tangible, something concrete, and worth remembering, worth telling. And putting it all together, the pieces that she receives from all the members of the family to show the larger trajectory, this collective family experience, as well as the private experiences that exist within that. So I wanted a narrator who had access to all the information, but also had all the investment and she, the risks and the rewards that come with being a first person narrator. So for me, that's the great fun of having a first person narrator, and she's kind of got this wise yet wounded, smart ass but tender voice. And in that voice, she's not holding back. She's not playing favorites. And because of the space that she occupies on the migratory spectrum, she's got no loyalties. So she doesn't have to pull any punches, to save face for Colombia or the United States, because she's one of those, in between types at this point as a result of her status.
Wow. I'm just going to remind everybody that if you go to the Q&A prompt at the bottom of the screen, you can add questions. There's some questions there. We'll be getting to them soon. But if anybody wants to ask anything, just type it in there and we'll be looking at it. Edwidge, there are many Haitis in your writing: the lived Haiti of the past, the remembered Haiti of white sand beaches and beautiful mountains, the dangerous Haiti of the unwary, the historic Haiti of the Great Slave Rebellion, and so on. Even the characters in your short stories, such as those in Everything Inside, cannot always reconcile all of them. I'm thinking of the narrator of Hot Air Balloons, but there are several others. How should readers understand these?
Well, I think, to quote Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the danger of a single story, just as, Patricia was saying about when people talk about the immigrant experience, and I think there's going to be a multiplicity of ways of viewing any country, right? Because you have differences in class, you have rural, urban, the rural areas in Haiti are literally called, people will say, the pays en dehors, which is the outside country. So that, there's already sort of an internal divide, whether you're, I guess that's true in any place, but whether you're urban versus a rural person, there is sometimes different words, different ways of speaking in different regions. And so I think Haiti is one of those places that people also are so reductive about, starting with Haiti was occupied by the United States from 1915 to 1934. There's an overlap also with the Dominican occupation to 1934. So the Dominican Republic was also occupied in a chunk of that time. At some point the US had control of the entire island. And so there were these Marines during that occupation who wrote these memoirs about us being cannibals, about, distorting voodoo, and then some of that, sort of that the single narrative of who we are has never left in terms of how people see Haiti. So for me, it's just like I wanted in my fiction from the time I started writing, and that doesn't mean that I was always, I was pleased the people I was writing about, like that they were happy about what I was writing, but I always wanted to show a multiplicity of voices, not only through my own writing, but the books that I edited and, the translations I worked on, and also bringing in Haitian writers from Haiti, writing forwards or introducing people to publishers to try to get like a big chorus going, because I think that's what makes the difference in terms of how a country is viewed. And I've always wanted, really, one of my great dreams for my work was that it would incite curiosity in other people about Haiti, about going out and reading other writers, and we do have, we have a great literary tradition with like a whole range of writers, but that's not so much known, outside of Haiti, and maybe in more of the French-speaking world. So that for me is like there are many Haitis, just like there are many Colombias, that there are many USs, right? But to get at that nuance and tell as many different types of stories as possible.
No, beautiful. And I'm jumping back for you, Patricia. This is like two celebrated authors and their greatest hits. So I'm going to move around a little bit, but here, in Veins of the Ocean, water is both a barrier and a connection, a taker and a giver of life. the veins pulse and bleed. How do Nesto, Carlito, and Reina's relationships with the water give definition to the novel?
Well, yeah, in the veins of the ocean, there's water is the life force and death force in so many ways, and it's described by each character in different ways, and it's a place that obviously so much life comes from, and our lives depends on the ocean, but also as a result of, again, migration and colonialism and all these things, it's a great mass graveyard in so many ways. So it's hard to answer that question, without kind of describing the entire book, because it means different things to Nesto, who's from Cuba and is on an island, and his life is defined by being surrounded by the ocean. In the case of Reina, who was born in Cartagena, facing, the southern side of the Caribbean. Her life is also defined by the ocean, in that her brother was tossed into it as a baby and is then incarcerated for tossing another baby into the ocean. And then both of their lives kind of merge as they take on a quest together to conquer their own captivity in certain ways by alleviating the captivity of other creatures. So it's really, I wrote that book. Now that I live in South Florida, I'm not from here. And I think because I'm not from here, and I'm an inland gal, I always had this enchantment with the ocean, and I still do. It's always remained something very sort of different for me, as opposed to people who grew up close to it and have a more casual relationship with it. For me, I'm constantly impressed by the ocean, and I try to write towards that awe and mystery, but also the power, the horrors, the truth, and the ways that we exploit the ocean in very tangible ways. I started writing The Veins of the Ocean right after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and which here in South Florida, where I live, for a period, there were just like these massive oil things, washing up for a while, and all these like dead fish and stuff. And it was amazing how quickly people got used to that. And that really impressed me as well, how people just kind of forget about the horrible things we do to the ocean. Never mind that without it, we're gonna die. So yeah, I think that's where my quest began, with The Veins of the Ocean. And then in exploring those larger questions, it was about personalizing them for the characters.
Really. Edwidge, there's another Dayton Literary Peace Prize author, I think it was Viet Thanh Nguyen, who said that immigrant or refugee writers should not try to explain unfamiliar cultural behaviors, history, or social conditions to their readers to make it easy for them. That it was the reader's job to take the writing on its own terms and fill in their own knowledge gaps. How do you approach cultural gaps that may exist between your readers and your characters, their settings and their lives?
Well, I completely agree with that notion. Initially, when there was especially when books were published in a kind of a series, there would be a glossary at the end, or a glossary of terms and so forth. But I think and I can't remember who said it, but it's like I can read Tolstoy and grasp the context. I don't have to live in that time period, or intimately know that culture or have it explained to me. I think any story that's sort of, everybody's crazy about the Elena Ferrante books, right? And you don't have to have extensive, she just immerses you in that. You don't have to have extensive knowledge of Naples to understand that. And so I agree with that. I think, and I go back to the storytellers of my childhood. Like, you basically told a story that was sometimes as unfamiliar as a story could be to a child. Most children's stories are like that. They have very grim realities with creatures that are not part of your surroundings, yet you still something to cling to there. So I agree that if you immerse your readers in this world, then and for me, I always have to see the world myself. I don't take anything for granted either. I have to, be able to see the story as in my own head, and just kind of and transcribe it for the reader, and that's any reader. And I'm always very conscious of my reader, perhaps more so than the reader who's not familiar with the culture. I'm thinking more of the reader who is, and how bored they would be if I was like overly explaining something that was already familiar to them.
That's Patricia, in Infinite Country and other works, is there a hierarchy of immigration that affects relationships in families and diaspora communities? Do the labels exiled, green card, legal, illegal, undocumented cling to the persons they describe? Do all levels share the same fears in a new country, if not themselves, for each other?
Well, I cannot speak for everyone. I can just use, my own community or family as an example. And within the community, no one cares what your status is. It's just everyone's just living life, within the own family. Perhaps where you can travel, where you can spend the holidays, if you can get, to the other side to be there for a special occasion or a wedding or a funeral. Well, that's subject to whatever you have going on legal-wise. But I've never seen anyone within a family or within the community sort of discriminate, based on someone's own paperwork. Quite the contrary. It's really, I've always seen people really looking out for each other and trying to help each other as much as possible, with the idea that it's nobody's fault, really. What the law says your right is, or what whether you can travel 10 miles this way or 10 miles that way. I think that something is in the United States, which is such a massive country, because we're so used to, all this space for us to move around in freely, we don't really consider how small some countries are in comparison, smaller than a lot of US states, and what that would be like to be confined to a space the size of a small US state and not being able to go beyond it should, the state of New Jersey have an economic collapse or something like that, and then I couldn't, travel into Pennsylvania or something for the resources that I need. So I just think when you start to think about kind of how arbitrary a lot of these things are, and about how in the United States, here, Edwidge and I are in Miami, we could travel to the other end of the country in Seattle in the same amount of time it would take for us to travel to London, and not have to show any papers or anything, and just travel that an enormous distance. And what kind of a privilege that is, that so many people don't have. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that was a very thoughtful question. I'm gonna just remind people to add your questions. We're getting close to the part where we're gonna have the viewers send their questions, and I'll go to them next. I have another question for Edwidge. When Uncle Joseph of Brother I'm Dying is buried in the US, his brother says, quote, "He shouldn't be here. If our country were ever given a chance and allowed to be a country like any other, none of us would live or die here." That single statement seems to capture the entire history of American and European treatment of Haiti since independence. It's a powerful indictment. What would giving Haiti the chance to be a country like any other country look like? What, for starters, would have to change in US policy?
Well, I mean, just the story of Haiti in itself, post independence, Haiti is the first place where enslaved people overcame their masters, and formed their own republic. And that was punished by, the rest of the world, certainly the United States. Haiti was completely isolated and then had to pay this enormous amount of money to France for their independence, which just initially out of the gate, strapped the country with this debt, with so much debt. So what it would look like is, something that the country's dealing with now, with with the people protesting against the president, and then just like the US is like, we support him, and a referendum coming up that people are don't want, but like, yeah, we support him, and then and then they feel he feels empowered because he has the support of the greater powers. And when people choose leaders that they that they want, if it's like it's not ones that the US approves of, then there's a coup, and that's sort of like the rinse and repeat. And so I guess self-realization, just like being allowed to really ever since the Haitian Revolution, Haiti has been, it is seen as a kind of bad example in terms of especially when we were still in a region where people were enslaved. Or in the opposite, like the Haitian leaders, they're like, we're going to the they wanted to go to when I went to the first time I went to Colombia, there was a statue of I think it was Pétion, like there's the statue of Haitian leaders at different places in Colombia, because after independence, these Haitian leaders were like, we're going to these, we want to help you with your independence, so that they wanted to spread that spirit. So I guess if that vision of our leaders who overcame the greatest armies in the world to form this republic, if that had been, we don't even know what that possibility, because from that moment on, until today, that the country has been like that. The full vision of that revolution has been fought and hindered at every step, along the way.
Wow. Okay, we have some viewer questions. This one is for Patricia from Kelly Pfeiffer. Hope I pronounced that correctly. How are Raina and Talia alike or different? And ultimately, what can one US citizen do to positively impact immigration policy?
Well, Talia and Raina, how are they alike? Let me think.
Or different.
Or different. Yeah, well, the character of Raina, the narrator of The Winds of the Ocean, was really coming from a place of being the victim and the survivor, and the one who's going to transcend a whole lot of intergenerational trauma. Talia is different in that although there's certainly a lot of trauma around her, she has been protected, she has been shielded. Yet her existence defines so much of the rest of her family's lives. Her absence defines the lives of her family that she's been living away from for the past 15 years. So I would say she's quite different in the sense that her life is, there is a trauma there, but she has been so guarded by it that she has not yet really begun to uncover all of it just yet. That's what made her so interesting for me. But the character of Raina is very close to my heart as well, because she's vulnerable, yet she is narrating also from a space of earnest excavation of all the crimes and traumas that have come before her in her family, her own, ways that she was complicit, the ways that she was not even aware that she was victimized, and moving beyond all that. So the second part of the question was, what can a U.S. citizen do?
What can one U.S. citizen do to positively impact immigration policy?
I would like to share this question with Edwidge, who probably has some better strategies or recommendations. I would say, in publishing in a country, it's always surprising to me the things that people see or don't see in something that I write. Sometimes people read a book in ways that you would never, ever expect. But one of the first emails that I got from a reader was from a gentleman in the Midwest who wrote me very concerned because he had read Infinite Country and had realized that he had been working for a tree cutting company in out west, where his coworkers were largely undocumented. They had been exploited. Their health had been put at risk. They had, endured all kinds of injustice. They were not protected. And he was like, what do? I don't work there anymore. How can I help them without putting them at risk because of their status and things like that? But these guys are sometimes getting killed, at the job, on the job site, or losing limbs, or enduring all sorts of injuries and things like that. And he was very worried. So he really wanted specific, concrete action. And we talked about some things like that. Whereas other people just want to really have their eyes opened, and in just opening their eyes to the experiences of people around them and saying, oh my gosh, I know someone who is in my own neighborhood or on my own block. And now I can, understand them or relate to them in a different way, when we interact. So I would say, it really depends on the individual. And I would never kind of give somebody orders on what to do. But the minute you start opening your eyes, you have to start asking yourself, what are you going to do now? So.
Edwidge, do you have any thoughts about positively impacting immigration policy? What can one person do?
Well, I think the first thing is to inform yourself, to get information. And there's some wonderful organizations out there like the American Immigration Council, the Americans for Immigrant Justice, among others. And even the ACLU has online a series of videos that I participated in, one in Creole, which has some tools for people who were, confronting ICE, right? And what you can do as a bystander, not to like get, but at least as a witness, right? Like what you can. So I think sharing information, and pre-COVID, there are always volunteer opportunities out there for people who want to, like, here, there's a place called Boys Town where they were detaining children. And so, when my girls were young, we would go there and just like hang out with the kids. And that was for them, they were supposed to be in school, but the teachers sometimes didn't come. So there are sometimes volunteer opportunities, especially with the unaccompanied children who sometimes have to go to court, like a 3-year-old in court, and they have to give them a cartoon to say, like, this is the judge, this is, there are some ways to volunteer. But I think first is certainly to inform yourself, get with some really good organizations and see what they're doing and ways that you can contribute. And the old way of like writing to your representative, let them know of your concern, because we have something like upwards of 11 million people who are vulnerable to what Patricia is talking about, because a lot of them are living in the shadows, right? And then we have people who are not in the shadows, like 800,000 DACA recipients who are waiting for something to be decided for them, TPS recipients who are waiting. So there's also so many different tiers to sort of like the vulnerability, the immigration vulnerability, and different proposed solutions to them. So I think people inform yourselves about what's going on, and if people are sort of leaning that way, to try to resist the villainization of that. And I think that's why, going back to like when people wear that immigrant like shirt, is to be like, which is, we shouldn't have to do, to be like, I'm just like you, like and that's also part of that, like to identify, like strengthen numbers, if you will.
Wow, that's great. I have a question I try to ask a lot of my friends who are writers, and you've mentioned it. We've talked about self-care and a little bit about process. But I know you two are close friends, and you live in Miami, and yet you said you haven't seen each other in so long. And I'm just wondering what the last year plus has been like for you in terms of, your productivity, your sanity. Has it changed the way you approach writing? I'm just curious about how you've managed to cope over this last year plus during COVID. And either one of you can take that.
You can start. I was talking last.
Sure. Well, it's been rough. I think it's been rough for a lot of people. Fortunately, I've not gotten sick, neither has anyone close to me in my family, but I also, for example, I brought, I became a mom in December, and my mom still hasn't met him, you know, so.
Mm.
So I think, there's no doubt all of this has been challenged by this year. I just want to say that something that's been interesting about releasing my new book, Infinite Country, during this year, which is my book is about a family that's separated as a result of immigration and deportation. And I think separation and family separation is something that a lot of Americans have gotten a taste of this year in some way. And I certainly am being separated from my family. And for the longest I ever have been in my life, have come to understand what they went through and being separated from theirs when they come to this country in new ways. So what can I say? The silver lining has been a whole lot of compassion and a whole lot of growth, and a whole lot of gratitude and optimism for what the road ahead, I hope, is same for everybody.
That's great. Another question for Edwidge. This is from Susan Kiak, and I actually have to say I have friends and family members who are big fans of your work, and Susan is a friend, and she says, Edwidge, I deeply feel what you said about your writing opening up Haiti for the world. You were the first Haitian author I read and taught, and your works inspired me to go to Haiti on my own. While there, I was amazed how differently I was treated once people realized I was not there as an aid worker, but there to be a tourist. What are your thoughts on what can be done to stop the what I call possibly erroneous, the aid exploitation of the Haitian people, particularly from those with a religious goal or changing folks?
I mean, it's such a big part of it that I'm not sure what can be done about it, frankly, and often, because and often the aid, like Susan is saying, is tied to some kind of, conversion or some other element. We have probably, it's like the terminology said, the sort of the Republic of NGOs, especially after the earthquake. And there's some, there's some good organizations. There's some, that do wonderful work, that have been on the ground for a very long time, and some that I'm involved with, that I've supported. And then so it's always to tell the difference. And there's now this other layer of organizations of diaspora folks, right, who go back and support the school they went to, who do that. So it's sort of differentiating, and between the I don't want to say so binary, the good and the bad, but I think it's to my uncle. My uncle Joseph was lived in Bel Air, which is this very specific neighborhood, had a clinic, had a school, and the most important thing, I think, it's to support local organizations, like people who, and there's so many, are people who are working on a string, as opposed to imposing something on the outside. And if you want to do something, go there and ask someone in, like a group in the organization. There's so many, groups that's like, what do you need? And I can accompany you. But I'm so happy that you got to go to Haiti. And yeah, people love it when you're when you're a tourist, because I think it feels like, it's like, okay, it's like what I was saying about my daughter, like, this is a place like any other. I can come and just eat good food and be on the beautiful beaches and that part of Haiti that people never really talk about.
Wow. I have one more question. It's from anonymous attendee. I'm not sure I know who that is, but for each of you, what is the role of fiction or creative nonfiction in working towards social justice and important policy changes? And I guess, Patricia, what is so unique about fiction that has the power to transform lives and reform perspectives?
I think there's a magic in fiction because, as a reader, you bring yourself into it. and you can pull meaning out of things that occur in fiction in a way where in nonfiction it's a bit different. Some the stories kind of just are what they are. Fiction allows me to pull from real life, and pull from the things that fascinate me or have affected me and assemble them in new ways to create new stories in a new world. And for me, that's, kind of a safe space in a lot of ways. But it allows a lot of freedom and exploration. So I think that the powers of fiction are limitless in those ways, and nonfiction too. But I think fiction sort of gives a lot of agency to the reader to be a participant as well, and to do their own work and extrapolating their own meanings and from the worlds of these characters.
That's great. And Edwidge, I guess we'll give you the nonfiction side of things.
Well, I mean, I think I totally agree with Patricia that fiction just puts you in the skin of another person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're reading a book and you know that the person in the book much more than like people in your own life. And I remember reading early on, like in high school, reading the Joy Luck Club and thinking, oh, these are my people. Like the mom is like my mom. And, there were just some quirks about like the dynamics that was so familiar to me, obviously while being a very different experience. The nonfiction, what I love about nonfiction is that, and I had to, to write Brother, I'm Dying. I remember when my first draft was like everything that happened. And then I found myself echoing my students when I turned my massive tome to my editor. And she's like, well, I don't think you need to describe those 3 visits to the doctor. And then I said, well, that's how it happened. That's what happened. And then, she said, my Robin Desser at Knopf, she said, think of with your fiction hat, like you're telling a story, you need pacing, you need, and then once I flipped into that really helped in terms of, and again, going back to storytelling, you have to frame it a certain way. You have to think of it as a narrative. And often, I think it's interesting that the best compliments that sometimes give to nonfiction is that they'll say, it reads like a novel. and then that's like, okay, and then it's working because it's like a story, like any other. And so I love that element about it. And I love that everything already exists and that it's just kind of like what you're pulling together and how you're framing it. And so in terms of writing Brother, I'm Dying, like structure was my biggest challenge in terms of like, how do I tell this very, very long and complicated story? So I decided I was going to alternately, between the present and the past and really use all the documents that we got from the government after my uncle died in immigration custody. So it was like, part of it was like journalistic, part of it was family history, part of it was a country history. So, but the biggest challenge was taking all this information and putting it in a particular structure.
I love that phrase. I hear it all the time. Reads like a novel. I'm waiting for someone to say it reads like a biography.
I don't think that will ever happen. Or if it does, they'll be like, oh, not a good thing.
That's what we call a failed novel, I guess. Listen, I just cannot thank you enough. This was so eye-opening, and it was really just a pleasure to see the both of you again. This is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Turn the page. I think it was the 4th one we've done, so stay tuned for future events. I want to thank Carol and Sharon for really some terrific questions, getting those together. But most of all, I want to thank Edwidge and Patricia for just generously donating their time this evening for this really lovely event. And it was really eye-opening, as I said, and I really enjoyed listening to you talk about such an important topic today. So thank you all, and thank you for coming tonight, and appreciate the questions from the audience as well. And we hope to see you at the next Turn the Page, Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.